Völker wollen nicht mehr auf den Schlachtfeldern sterben, damit diese wurzellose internationale Rasse an den Geschäften des Krieges verdient und ihre alttestamentarische Rasswut erträgt. Über der jüdischen Parole, Proletarier aller Länder, vereinigt euch!
Adolf Hitler has come to completely change the lives of Germans. Promises of prosperity seemed to materialize immediately after taking power in 1933. The nation rises from the ashes, or at least that is what Nazi propaganda shows. Sectors that supported the regime began to enjoy economic benefits, but someone has to pay for it. The persecution of different groups grows more and more. However, the main victim is the Jewish people. That illusion of a flourishing country serves to hide part of the enormous dictatorship that is consolidating at the head of Germany. Education is now a not-so-discreet camouflage for indoctrination. The fear of repression is the preferred tool for controlling those who oppose the Führer. Military rearmament is the ultimate goal. Hitler is preparing people for war, and the entire population is blindly following him. In this new military history video, we will walk through the German streets during the Third Reich to discover how people lived. We will learn about the suffering of the less fortunate and why the Nazi leader received so much support for his dream of building a new empire.
For most Germans, these were good years, a time of growing prosperity. Hitler's Nazis had promised national revival, and they boasted enormous popular support.
Before the outbreak of World War II, life in Nazi Germany was marked by a radical transformation in almost every aspect of society. However, even though we may now think of it in a negative light, as it was a totalitarian and racist dictatorship, the population at that time viewed it in a positive light. A crucial aspect that influenced this view was the country's economic growth. During his political campaign, Adolf Hitler managed to reach large crowds by using people's anger over the defeat in World War I and the signing of the Treaty of Versailles. This agreement was signed by rulers around the world to end the conflict, held Germany responsible for the conflict, and punished the country severely. Through it, the nation lost more than 10% of its territory, and its army was reduced to 100,000 men. In addition, it was prohibited from recruiting new soldiers, and most of its weapons were confiscated. Finally, he was fined heavily, leaving his finances in ruins. The Führer channeled the anger of the Germans over the harsh penalty and took advantage of it. He made them a promise. The German people would prosper. To the surprise of some, when he won support to take over the government, he kept his word. On January 30th, 1933, Hitler took power, and over the next 6 years, the standard of living of the population improved considerably. The Third Reich obtained funds through a combination of confiscated property from Jews and loans taken out abroad. Thanks to this, it generated various public works projects, such as the construction of schools and hospitals. This policy served to create millions of jobs and achieve a substantial drop in unemployment in the country. While this represented an achievement in itself, it also sought to provide help to the Germans by granting loans or reducing taxes. From these benefits, the Germans could go on vacation, buy modern domestically manufactured cars or access new technological wonders such as television. The population was happy with the progress that had been achieved and reflected this with unconditional support for the Führer, their hero, their savior.
Bubbling enthusiasm. It was contagious. One woman turned to me, a perfect stranger, and said, "He is my mother and my father. He keeps me safe from all harm."
Germany in these years was gripped in a cult of the Führer, the leader. The Nazis urged Germans to put their differences aside, to rally behind Hitler.
The kind actions of the state continued to accumulate in different areas, while the affection for Hitler increased. The regime encouraged outdoor activities and subsidized all kinds of sports. There was even a government organization dedicated to leisure, with proposals for adults and children. The family was the central value of the Nazi universe: father, mother, and if possible, many children. That was what was going to ensure the greatness of the nation. With this in mind, the Third Reich also included loans on favorable terms for newlyweds, which substantially increased marriages. Along with this, particularly prolific women were rewarded with medals and financial benefits. However, those who did not meet the standards of the supposed pure race that Nazism promoted suffered another fate.
Diary, Berlin, December the 10th, 1935. The Genetic Health Act, or sterilization law, has been passed and envisages extensive examinations and tests for engaged couples before they get married. If things continue like this, we'll soon have a race of supermen. So far, there is no sign of this happening.
This regulation was key to the regime. Through the so-called Nuremberg laws, the first thing that was sought was to prohibit marriages between Aryans and Jews or any other person belonging to groups considered inferior. Following that, only German women considered pure were encouraged to reproduce en masse. Meanwhile, Hebrews, Gypsies, disabled women, or those belonging to other circles called undesirable, were subjected to forced sterilizations. This was part of a broad eugenics program implemented by the Third Reich, which sought to eliminate the transmission of certain genes within the population. The Nazis dreamed of being able to control the offspring that would dominate the world once they rebuilt the German Empire. But for that to happen, it was necessary for the Aryan race to unite in order to procreate quickly. A peculiarity about the incentives we talked about earlier was that of the awards. On August 12th of each year, coinciding with Hitler's mother's birthday, the Führer himself awarded the most prolific women the Cross of Honor. It was bronze for those who had more than 4 children, silver for those who had more than 6, and gold for those who had more than 8. Likewise, the 10th child of a pure German woman was sponsored by the Nazi leader and had to be named Adolf. Now, beyond the fact that many felt honored to contribute to their country, there were several other aspects that influenced the lives of the nation's mothers. Sterilizations were not the only way in which the government controlled female sexuality. The state promoted chastity before marriage and severely punished adultery, especially among non-Aryan groups of people. On the contrary, those women who met the parameters of racial purity were often taken to establishments where they were forced to have sex with an SS soldier to become pregnant and strengthen the people. The Third Reich exercised dictatorial control, But Germans who saw the economic benefits and were enthralled by Hitler's nationalist rhetoric turned a deaf ear to the suffering of minorities. During the early years, even people in neighboring countries such as Poland recognized the government's work and moved to Nazi soil.
I come to Germany convinced that the overwhelming majority of the people don't find the political system of the Third Reich unjust or harmful. On the contrary, I'm convinced that many millions of people are profiting from Hitler's victory. Above all, unemployed people and everyone whose life is filled with national pride. I'm convinced that the system has indeed taken away certain moral values from people, but in its place has brought material advantages.
This view is a clear example of how the population accepted everything that happened around them. In line with the role that women occupied, the slogan that encapsulated the Nazi vision was Kinder, Küche, Kirche. The first word translates as children and refers to their aforementioned obligation to have and raise children. The second means kitchen and speaks of the fact that they had to take care of the home and domestic chores. The last is church, since German women had to maintain a moral and religious life within the values of Christianity. For Hitler, women could not be part of the Nazi Party or have a job. Their political or public participation was considered inappropriate. He encouraged even professional women to leave their positions so that they could be occupied by men. In this way, they should only dedicate themselves to the proliferation of the race. As expected, in the midst of a regime that knew how to use propaganda as its most powerful weapon, organizations were created for the indoctrination of the new generations. There, both young women and men were actively recruited to promote National Socialist ideology and reinforce each other's traditional roles.
The Germans adore military show. In Nazi Germany, everyone has a uniform. If it isn't the uniform of the Army, Navy or Air Force, it is that of the SA, SS or some party organization. Even the little boys and girls have been strutting about in the uniform of the Hitler Youth or the Union of German Girls.
In the case of the female groups, women were taught how to do household chores and the importance of being wives and mothers loyal to the regime. Nazi values were also instilled in young girls, and they were prepared for their future. Meanwhile, the Hitler Youth aimed at boys had another focus. This was a movement driven by the Führer's party, which sought to indoctrinate the next generations to perpetuate the 1,000-year Reich. That was the National Socialist vision, which thought of centuries and centuries of German domination worldwide. And to achieve this, it was necessary to place special emphasis on young people as the leaders of tomorrow. Given this, the teaching focused on militancy of ideals, physical training, racial concepts, and absolute obedience to Hitler. This movement was something more than just a German version of the Boy Scouts, and it soon became the entry of youth into a military life. The Nazi leader knew that his future soldiers were being trained there for the Great War he was about to lead. In 1936, this paramilitary organization became compulsory for all children between the ages of 10 and 18. However, it was not the only place where the regime's indoctrination took place. Schools also became centers where children were instilled with National Socialist values, even before opening a textbook. From the beginning, buildings already displayed signs with swastikas and portraits of Hitler, as well as the Nazi flag in the playground. Although some subjects, such as mathematics and physics, did not change much, others underwent dramatic changes. In biology classes, teachers focused on racial purity, contrasting the superiority of Aryan students with members of the Jewish community. Likewise, they told girls to be selective with their marriage partners, encouraging them to avoid interracial reproduction. Great importance was also placed on physical activity. In 1934, the Nazis brought back the 3-lesson-a-week drill program that had been eliminated under the previous government. In addition to improving the health of the children, the practice was designed to teach leadership skills and provide a soldier's mindset. Geography classes were also riddled with propaganda, with books emphasizing geopolitics, the expansion of Germanic tribes throughout history, and German superiority that was to flourish again. Despite all the preparations for war, the population was unaware of how close the conflict was. They lived in a deceptive sense of peace and tranquility, where Hitler was an exemplary leader.
Yesterday, we followed the ceremonies on Bückerberg on the radio. Once again, Hitler spoke excellently. All over the world, war, strikes, unrest. Here, profound peace. The people know this, or they would not celebrate him so much.
Undoubtedly, Nazi propaganda was doing its job perfectly. And while most Germans were living a good life, hatred towards a small portion of the population was growing more and more. It was they who knew the dark side of the Führer's dictatorship from the very first moment. As you can imagine, we are talking about the Jews. However, in addition to racial discrimination, this group was pointed out as the culprit of all the evils that had plagued Germany in the past. This generated hatred and fierce persecution.
After the seizure of power, the National Socialists are able to connect directly with the anti-Jewish attitude of many resort managements and hoteliers. In 1935, Jewish tourists are completely excluded from the beaches of the German North and Baltic Seas. A corresponding decree from the Reich Ministry of the Interior in July 1937 is thus superfluous.
Despite this, anti-Semitism cannot be attributed exclusively to the Nazi regime, as it had existed in Europe for several centuries. The early Christian church described them as people who were unwilling to accept the word of God, who were agents of the devil and murderers of Jesus. During the Middle Ages, they were prevented by laws from owning land or holding public office. They were excluded from most occupations, forcing them to earn their living through money lending, trade, and exchange. They were accused of causing plagues, killing children for religious rituals, and secretly plotting to dominate the world. None of these accusations were true, but they were conveniently taken up by Hitler to develop his plan. The Jews were labeled as the worst of evils. Everything negative that had an impact on Germany was attributed to them, who now no longer represented just a group of another religion, but a completely different and inferior race in the eyes of the Third Reich. The persecution led to the expropriation of all their assets to fill the coffers of the Nazi government, and various personalities left the country for fear of repression.
In the summer of 1935, Berlin looked like the cosmopolitan city it had been before 1933. A lot of traffic, advertising, hustle, tourists, and bustling activity. The expulsion of many artists and scientists was not readily apparent.
A ruthless enemy had been created that was being defeated by the powerful Führer. Thus, the leader finished conquering the hearts of his people. Whatever he proposed, he would have the unconditional support of the Germans. In this way, it was not difficult to carry out one of the greatest atrocities of humanity, the Jewish extermination known as the Holocaust. Millions of people who belonged to this group were confined in concentration camps, where they lived in inhuman and cruel conditions. Those who did not die from this were sent to the gas chambers where they were murdered. There is no doubt that this was the darkest chapter of Nazi Germany, but the Jews were not the only ones persecuted by the regime. In fact, any opposition to the Third Reich was crushed. Democratic institutions were dismantled with Hitler's rise to power. Organizations like the Gestapo and the SS were key in monitoring, intimidating, imprisoning, and eliminating political dissidents, communists, trade unionists, and anyone who posed a threat to Nazi ideology. Both the state's secret police and its paramilitary group carried out arbitrary arrests without trial. At the slightest suspicion of being an opponent, the person was simply arrested and sent to the same concentration camps where the Jews ended up. In this way, the Nazis quickly eliminated anyone who was against the policies of the Third Reich. And despite so much darkness, the streets of Germany continued to show the population enjoying an alternative reality.
The year 1937 is the quietest of Hitler's 12-year reign. There are no foreign policy provocations, no new racist laws, no publicly staged pogroms. If one were to believe the footage shot by amateur filmmakers who come from the upper middle class, the people in Hitler's Reich enjoy their lives.
Finally, in 1939, the Nazi farce collapses. Adolf Hitler's true aspirations are revealed with the invasion of Poland. The military rearmament that had been taking place in the shadows has been a great success. The country's armed forces are powerful and are advancing rapidly with the Führer's expansion plan. The Second World War begins to take shape, and the German population that enjoyed privileges by simply looking the other way has now become involved in the largest conflict in humanity. The conflict will leave millions dead and the fall of the Third Reich. The Germans will once again be plunged into misery, with a country totally in ruins and controlled by the enemy. The rest is history.
The full name is Gert Friedrich Franz Schmitz. And I remember on September the 1st, 1939, Hitler was on the radio telling that the war started. Since 5 o'clock this morning, our troops marching into Poland, doing whatever they do best. 6 months later, Hitler marched into the France. The British came and the Americans came into the war. And I talked to my grandpa, and he told me, he said, if they want to win the war, it don't look too good. He said, don't say that, Grandpa, we cannot lose the war. That was not even remotely in my mind that we ever could lose the war, you know, because we were so conditioned politically. Hitler controlled the newspapers, they controlled the radio, and Goebbels, the propaganda minister, he controlled everything else. And we listened to the news, and they told us all about going on in the Western Front and how successful they are and all that. And then we walked outside and we heard the guns.
What you just heard are the memoirs of Gert Friedrich Franz Schmitz, a Nazi pilot of the Luftwaffe who fought in World War II under the command of Adolf Hitler. Have you ever wondered what it must have felt like to be a German soldier in the 1940s? In this new video from Military History, we invite you to step fully into the shoes of the German combatants. Get ready to discover a hidden side of the greatest conflict of the 20th century like you've never seen before. Technology allows us to access the memories of this German man, born on October 11, 1927, in Milrath. By the time the German operation in Polish territory began, Schmitz was only 12 years old. He was still an impressionable child, marked by a lifetime of National Socialist education. Keep in mind that since the 1930s, the front led by Adolf Hitler was the hegemonic force within Germany. As Gert recalls, they had control of all media channels. From there, they formed a harsh opinion within the populace.
They had everything organized. You couldn't get lost or fall through the cracks. You know, there were no cracks. You were part of it if you liked it or not. I got drafted into the Hitler Youth when I was 10 years old. And they gave us a uniform and all that, you know.
The Hitler Youth was a central element within the doctrine of the Third Reich. They were indoctrination groups established by the National Socialist Party in 1922, aimed at creating a new educational system for young Germans. From a young age, they were provided with military training and encouraged to develop an understanding of Nazi ideology. Among their principles were racism, nationalism, physical activity, camaraderie, outdoor life, invocation of blood purity, and honor. The ultimate goal was to train the leaders of the future. In 1923, this organization had around 1,000 members. 4 years later, the figure multiplied by 5. By 1930, there were already 25,000 boys, while at the time of Adolf Hitler's rise to power in 1934, attendance increased exponentially. Documents speak of more than 300,000 young people affiliated with this indoctrination group. Among them was Gert Friedrich Franz Schmitz. Once he completed his initial stint with the Hitler Youth, the boy received a seductive offer from the most prestigious force in all of Germany, the Luftwaffe, the feared air force of the Reich.
They said, "Do you want to go to a jet pilot training school? We have one in Fulda, Germany. And you go over there and you start training for a flying Messerschmitt 262 jets." He said, "Shoot, yeah." And when I got up there, the hangars were bombed, the runways were bombed, the airplanes were bombed. And there was nothing left for us to do. And they said, "Well, we'll temporarily assign you to a paratrooper outfit and send you to the Western Front."
That's how Schmitz ended up fighting on the bloody Eastern Front, more precisely in the German city of Pasewalk. In that region of Europe, the Axis faced almost exclusively the Soviet Union and its allies, resulting in particularly bloody battles due to the pre-existing hatred between those peoples. Many experts claim that the Eastern Front was the most decisive in defining the German defeat, accounting for at least 70% of the fallen soldiers of the Third Reich. And it was to that terrible zone that Schmitz was sent as a young graduate of the Hitler Youth.
We talked to the people, the local people there. They heard on the news that the Russians had just come from the south, from the east and south, and cut off that air base where we were. And that was bad news.
Gert managed to escape from the Russians. Being captured by the Red Army would have meant brutal torture, and in many cases, death after a long stay in detention centers. The problem was that in his retreat, he dangerously approached British and American troops, which outnumbered the German ones. By 1945, the outcome of the war was apparent. It was only a matter of time before the defeat of the Third Reich was sealed. Even a young soldier like Schmitz could perceive the disorganization and problems facing Hitler's armed forces.
There was an open field and they wanted to march into the woods. And what we were way behind as a rear guard, they walked into a trap. The Americans, they already were on 3 sides when they waited till the whole battalion marched in there and they mowed them down. So the 4 of us, we went off to the right into the woods and disappeared in the woods. And that's how we ended up behind enemy lines.
Along with his 3 companions, Gert fled from the Allied checkpoints that were gradually dominating all the routes and roads of Germany. In silence and starving, they reached Dülmen. They arrived in the city during the day. The area looked peaceful, almost like an oasis amidst so much violence.
They said, well, that must be a park. Nobody is fighting in the park, so we're going to be pretty safe. So we got over and climbed over that 6-foot fence. GIs walking all over the place there. And they saw us and they started shooting at us. They had a 2.5 truck with machine guns on there. They came around and started shooting at us with that. And then we said, we got to get out of this park. So we jumped over the fence. Then there was tanks on the outside. They said, that ain't not safe either. Let's jump back in the fence. We jumped back over that 6-foot fence. And then that truck came and started shooting at us. We went back over the fence again and went in the other direction. And we saw a pine forest over there. And they said, let's get into that forest and get the heck out of here.
The situation was worrying. Surrounded by hundreds of heavily armed Allied troops, the 4 Germans only found refuge behind the pines. It was only a matter of time before they were caught, presenting a new problem. How to surrender peacefully without triggering a shootout in which they would likely be killed. The protagonist of this story found a rather curious solution.
And they came and I stood behind that tree. You know, we all stood behind each one of those trees. It was just big enough to hide us. And they said, what I'm gonna do, you know, if we can't run, they're gonna start shooting at us. And I finally, I put my hand out and waved, you know, and say, hi. And they said, come on out, you know, hands up, hands up. And that's how we got captured.
Already under American custody and awaiting transfer to a prisoner of war camp in the United States, Gert began a long journey across Europe. He was constantly relocated as the Allies pacified different war zones. According to his own words, he spent most of his time drawing to depict the experiences he lived as a prisoner. After several months, Germany finally surrendered. The war ended, and many captured soldiers, those of lower rank who hadn't committed provable crimes, were sent home. But that home no longer existed. Now Germany was a destroyed wasteland, ravaged by bombing campaigns and with virtually no industry. After years of hardship as his country recovered from devastation, in 1952, Gert decided to journey to the United States, where he began a new life. There, he served in Uncle Sam's army and even participated as an aerospace engineer alongside renowned specialists in the field. Schmitz was a key member of the space program, holding several patents in his name. Additionally, he was a founding member of the von Braun Astronomical Society. Schmitz often recalled his childhood in Germany, both the good and the bad. Family moments and days of hunger and war marked his generation. Gert enjoyed recounting these memories. It was the best way to keep the memory of his parents and grandparents alive. Throughout this video, we saw one of his last interviews, in which he compiled much of his service for the Third Reich and the way he was captured by the Allies. Beyond all the death and violence that inhabit his story, his narrative closes with a reflection as simple as it is true.
War is the stupidest thing that man invented. If you can't talk it out, if you cannot communicate, you start fighting. You have to do away with your problem. You have to annihilate your problem. But that is not a solution. Yeah, that just create more problems.
Testimonies like that of Gert Friedrich Franz Schmitz are essential for understanding in depth the functioning of the institutions of the Third Reich, as well as the human factor that composed those forces. Let's take, for example, the aforementioned Luftwaffe, one of the great pillars of the German offensive during World War II. After assuming power in Germany in 1933, the first thing Adolf Hitler did was to secretly begin developing his military air force. Remember that after the defeat in World War I, the Treaty of Versailles severely limited German military development, but the National Socialist leader had no intention of obeying those terms. After several moves to organize his troops, on February 26, 1935, the top Nazi ordered his air minister, Hermann Göring, to formally rebuild the German aviation. This new war instrument was presented to the world in March of that same year. The growth was surprising. Thousands of pilots were quickly incorporated, and air bases were opened throughout German soil. There, the future airmen of the Third Reich were trained. The Luftwaffe, through the country's main aeronautical companies, designed and built thousands of aircraft at an average rate of almost 15,000 units per year. In total, before and during World War II, German industries built nearly 86,000 aircraft of all shapes, modalities, and uses. Precisely, one of the most significant changes brought about by the Second Global Conflict was the full integration of aviation into the war world. Although during World War I the use of aircraft had been more limited, it still served for many countries to realize the importance of having an air force as a battle instrument. Like in the rest of the social strata during the National Socialist era, the Luftwaffe was sustained not only by its massiveness and technological power, but also by the ideological construction in the training of its pilots. Each tactic was also based on a racist and imperial ideology. Germany deserved Europe. It was its vital territory, and it had the authority to take it by force. Let's listen to the testimonies of a member of this force who recalls one of the most popular songs of that time.
Kamerad, Kamerad, der Befehl ist da, wir starten. Kamerad, Kamerad, alle Mädels müssen warten. Die Losung ist bekannt, ran an den Feind, Bomben auf England.
Por supuesto, eso estaba cada día en las noticias de las Fuerzas Armadas. Se oía esa canción de Inglaterra y así era como preparaban a la gente para que se preocupase realmente por aquello.
You have just heard the words of Horst Petschler, a distinguished pilot of the German Air Force, who achieved more than 20 victories aboard a Messerschmitt Bf 109 G10. Several decades have passed, but that song still resonates in his mind, seeking to ignite the spirits of young soldiers, already tired after a superhuman effort fighting against the Allies. The lyrics speak of abandoning women and vices and running towards the enemy, England. The British island was one of the primary objectives of the German aviation. There they unloaded hundreds of thousands of kilograms of explosives that devastated entire cities. But these types of offensives could not be carried out forever. There was a material and human limit that became increasingly apparent as France, the United States, and the Soviet Union surrounded Germany. During the final months of World War II, Luftwaffe pilots took to the skies in risky flights to counter Allied bombing raids on the heart of the Third Reich. Let us turn once again to the memoirs of pilot Petschler.
Siempre teníamos que despegar cuando venían al centro de Alemania. Y nos colocábamos delante de la formación de bombarderos. Evitábamos los ataques desde atrás porque eran demasiado costosos. Éramos probablemente 20 o 30 109s y Focke-Wulfs. Nos desplegábamos y nos lanzábamos. Y había piezas volando por todas partes. Veía paracaídas, veía aviones, cazas chocando con los bombarderos de lleno.
The scene Petscheller describes as chaotic and desperate. In some ways, it resembles that recounted earlier by Schmitz. Towards the close of the war, disorganization took all German forces hostage, leading to reckless actions and the unnecessary deaths of thousands of young soldiers. Having failed to achieve victory over the Soviet Union in 1942, the Luftwaffe was embroiled in a great war of attrition that stretched to North Africa. With the entry of the United States into the war and the resurgence of the offensive power of the Royal Air Force of the United Kingdom, the front on German soil, known as the Defense of the Reich, was created. The strength of the mythical institution was slowly eroded, and by mid-1944, it had practically disappeared from the skies of Western Europe, leaving the German army without support. More than any other force, the Luftwaffe was deeply involved in Nazi crimes and the extermination of tens of thousands of people. By the end of the war, a significant percentage of aircraft production originated in concentration camps, an industry that employed multitudes of prisoners. Lack of food and hard manual labor often resulted in the deaths of the victims. To put it in terms of numbers, in January 1944, Messerschmitt and its contractors used 7,564 slaves. The Heinkel industry and its subsidiaries had another 9,724, while Junkers used 1,571. Such a death factory could only be sustained with an ideological steel fist, which began to be sown from the early stages of the development of young Germans. This requires us to return to a topic that we have already explored in this video, but which we must learn more about: the Hitler Youth. What you just saw was the gigantic parade of the Hitler Youth in 1937. Tens of thousands of teenagers gathered to celebrate the ideology of National Socialism, receiving personal congratulations from the supreme leader of the movement. Within just 2 years, many of these children were already well-trained soldiers in the art of war, the backbone of the German armed forces. By 1945, many of these childish faces were buried in the ground. After 6 years of brutal fighting against the Allies. The importance of this ideological tool cannot be underestimated. These parades were the breeding ground for the most powerful military force of their generation, one driven by hatred and the desire to conquer. The time commitment and regular exposure to Nazi ideology weakened the influence of parents, teachers, religious figures, and other voices of authority. In fact, the Hitler Youth and the League of German Girls even encouraged their members to report to their leaders any suspicious behavior that occurred in their schools, churches, and families. The curious thing is that this gigantic mobilization of 1937 was not the first, but rather the high point of a tradition of several years. As we anticipated, the Hitler Youth was created in the mid-1920s, and every year about 2,000 boys had to march on foot from various points of Germany to the Nuremberg Congregation, one of the most important events of the National Socialist Party. being invited to this parade was an honor, and every young German was prepared to sweat in the sun to arrive on time. As the Hitler Youth grew in number, so did the dispersion of institutions across the country. By the mid-1930s, there were factions that had to travel up to 800 kilometers to reach the meeting in Nuremberg, a distance that was covered on foot. Such a physical challenge had only one clear explanation. These children had to be prepared for war, and in war there is no room for compassion for weakness. All that matters is to carry out the orders that were assigned to them. When the boys grew up and were trained in various military trades, their officers and tutors recruited them for special forces according to their aptitudes and interests. As we told you previously, Gert Schmitz was taken to an airbase to be trained as a fighter pilot. This was one of the most prized roles, since fighting in the skies had an aura of mysticism incomparable to other institutions. The less fortunate were sent to the infantry, or here, the ground units of the Wehrmacht. During World War II, more than 13.5 million soldiers served in the Heer, of whom some 4 million died. At the same time, there was the Waffen-SS, a sort of elite commando force made up of up to 900,000 soldiers. Although both forces fought side by side, the Waffen-SS never belonged to the bulk of the ground troops. They were an autonomous and highly independent front. Let us listen to the words of a man who took part in the shootings of prisoners carried out by this elite commando force.
Mit denen konnten sie machen, was sie wollten. Versuchen sich vorzustellen, da ist ein Graben, da stehen Menschen an einer Seite und dahinter stehen Soldaten, das waren wir, und die haben geschossen. Und die getroffen wurden, die sind runtergefallen.
Das, was Sie, während Sie geschossen haben, gedacht oder empfunden haben, das möchte ich, dass Sie mir das noch einmal sagen.
Nichts. Ich habe nur überlegt, Ziele vorsichtig.
His story is cold and painful, but also real. Everything we tell you about the ideological work of the Reich had a direct impact on the commitment of its troops to the murder of millions. Within the German forces, there were all kinds of soldiers: the convinced fanatics, those who were recruited out of obligation and fear, and even those who did not understand what they were doing. People who were swept away by the tide of history to become monsters in the service of one of the darkest leaders. Millions of deaths, a complete reconfiguration of Europe, and the discovery of crimes that were thought impossible within a modern society. The Second World War continues to be one of the most studied historical events. The wounds and scars obtained in that conflict continue to mark the present, so it is still essential to listen to the testimonies of those who lived through that hell. As time passes, the protagonists succumb to old age, but technology allows us to immortalize their memories as if they were first-person documentaries. This way, we come to the end of the video. If you like this content and want to continue learning fascinating stories about World War II, we invite you to subscribe and activate notifications on our channel. Without further ado, we say goodbye until the next installment of Military History. Thank you for joining us.